Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to be at the kind of tail end of St. Patrick's Day to talk to you guys a little bit about Irish female immigration in the late 19th century, specifically to the United States. I know a lot of you are probably thinking, well, what about everywhere else? Irish immigration is such a big topic. So it's really hard to try to talk about it all at once. So we're just going to focus on the late 19th century. We're going to focus on women traveling to the United States. Now, the reason why I think this is really kind of an important topic is because much of Irish American history and pop culture has focused on the stories of the Irish laborer. So these are the people building our bridges, building canals, working on the railroad, laying the foundations of urban America. But what about the Irish women? A lot of them traveled primarily alone in very large numbers. So this program is going to address a few main themes / questions. First being, why did these women choose to leave Ireland? Why did they travel alone? After arriving to the United States, how were they able to find work, family, and community, and a new home that was not entirely welcoming to their presence? The majority of the group that we're talking about are going to be Catholic. Now, they're coming to a Protestant country that they're really not wanted. So we're going to kind of get into how did these people find community, right? But more importantly, how does this knowledge help us better understand our family story? How do we incorporate something like what we're going to talk about, which is social history, basically, into our genealogy research? So to kind of start us off, we're going to talk about Ireland after the famine. Now, the Irish potato famine, also known as the Great Hunger, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of the famine because I can do an entirely separate program just talking about the famine, the ramifications of it, and the famine immigrants, right? So the people we're talking about are going to be the children of individuals who were adults during the famine. So the descendants of people who were living through the famine between 1845 and 1852. The major things you need to know for the sake of this program is that in this time frame between 1845 and 1852, about 1 million people are going to die, and then 2 million approximately are going to leave Ireland. But that doesn't end in 1852. That continues on for generations after. So we're talking about the generations after. So for women living in rural Ireland, all right, what is their home life going to look like? So for living conditions, houses were typically rectangular in shape, about 1 room deep, with a kitchen located between 2 bedrooms. Roofs were made of reed thatch or straw. Now the picture you see here, you have half of this building has thatch roof. The other half has slate. That's something that would come in later in the 19th century. But it wasn't super prevalent really until the end. Now, windows were not super prominent in these homes. I know you're probably thinking, why do we care about windows? Well, here's the thing. The windows, the lack of windows, it did keep the house warmer and it helped keep the dampness out, but there's also kind of a social aspect to that as well. At one point, there was a tax on windows, chimneys, and doors. So I know it's a very strange tax, but it existed. But even after that tax no longer existed, people still opted to not have too many windows out of concern that their landlords would see this and think that they are affluent and raise their rent. So you're not going to have a lot of windows. It's going to be pretty dark. The floor is going to be typically a dirt floor. Later in the 19th century, you're going to get wood floor on top of that. You're not going to have a gas stove. You're not going to have a coal burning stove. You're going to have a hearth and a floor level fire. So you're also going to not have indoor plumbing. Now, Ireland did not get indoor plumbing. I mean, the rural Ireland, at least, a good portion of the country didn't get indoor plumbing until at least the 1970s. Now, I know some of you, I know my father is one included, who remembers going to go visit grandparents, out in the country who had outhouses, right? Yeah, so this is not a completely foreign concept to everyone. As far as housework goes, I have on this slide, you're cooking over an open fire. That means you're bending over a lot. You're having to handle very heavy pots. So housework, or domestic work, so to speak, is going to be quite different than the type of domestic work that you would be doing in urban United States. And as far as the lack of indoor plumbing goes, no running water, that's kind of a big deal. This means that you're gonna be, hauling water from wells and pumps and springs. It's a lot. You're emptying chamber pots into outhouses. So a woman's day is going to consist a lot of kind of running back and forth into the house in between the rain and the awful weather you're going to see at different points in Ireland. Honestly, much like the weather we're seeing today in Fort Wayne. Now, let's go to the next slide. What did women do for work in Ireland? So there were, outside of farm work, there are going to be few employment opportunities for women, especially in rural Ireland. Industrialization had actually declined after the famine, so it was limited to cities in the northeast of Ireland, in addition to some industrial cities like Dublin and Waterford and Cork. So what's on this slide are kind of your three big ones. You have agriculture work, which is going to include, the dairy industry, making butter, raising poultry. Raising poultry is kind of interesting because that money was actually really important to the Irish families' like household income, because that they were making enough money usually, either monetary or through bartering, to pay for rent, to buy things like groceries. So raising poultry was actually kind of important. And then you also had home industries like lace making, embroidery, crocheting, and then domestic work. Domestic work in Ireland is not the same type of domestic work in the United States. You're not working in a upper middle class household. It's more akin to being a farm laborer. So it's going to be very physically strenuous on these women. Oh, I had that on the slide. I completely forgot. So marriage in Ireland is going to be a little complicated. So there was an increase in the marriage age and a decrease in marriage rate for this generation, which means women were getting married older, significantly older. So by the 1880s, the Irish married at the latest, which means oldest, ages in Europe. So over 35 years old for men and 29 for women. So the reason why this is the case, a lot of it has to do with changes in inheritance practices. Basically, instead of splitting land amongst heirs, which had been the common practice in Ireland, only one son would inherit. So that leads us to, oh, there we go. Forgot there was more on this slide. That leads us to the dowry system. Now, a dowry, also known as a fortune, was something that pretty much all girls had to pay. And a lot of people can afford to pay this. And how this kind of links into this whole inheritance thing, I'm not going to go too deep into detail, but basically, these women are not going to want to marry somebody who has no land. So there are few appropriate marriage opportunities. And as far as the dowry goes, it's going to be an arranged marriage through a matchmaker, which, interestingly enough, there's actually a matchmaking festival in County Clare that still happens. So matchmaking for this generation, it becomes very much a part of the culture, and that continues for a long time, as we can see by the fact that there's currently still a matchmaking festival. So it's going to be through either money or land or cattle. So the parents of the groom or the inheriting male heir would decide when it was time for their son to marry, because it meant that they would have to relinquish authority over the land and the home, which is also contributing to why people are getting married older. They are the ones that calculate how much the dowry will cost. So they're saying, okay, it's going to cost us this much money to feed this girl, to clothe this girl, to support this girl, which is why the dowries were quite expensive. So in the 1880s, a dowry would amount to 10 to 12 years worth of rent for land. If you did not have a dowry, you didn't get married. Not in Ireland, at least. Oh, let me go back. Went too fast. Yeah. So if you're not getting married, you're going to become spinster. Now, that means you are going to be the financial dependent of your siblings or other extended family members for the rest of your life. So in a way, in some respects, there have been historians who have argued that in this time period, if a woman cannot marry in Ireland, they were not even considered an adult. Even if they had a job, they weren't considered an adult. So these kind of factors of the limited employment options and the not being able to marry, not being able to have your own independent identity, that's really going to push women out of the country. And in fact, the families of these girls, especially if you can only afford to pay for a dowry for one daughter and you have 5 of them, you're going to want to send the rest of them away, because otherwise they're going to be somebody else's quote unquote problem. So you're going to want to push the daughters to immigrate. And a lot of the times you're going to push your daughters to immigrate more so than the men, is because it was believed actually at one point that the daughters were more likely to send money home. They were more likely to save their money and not waste it on frivolous things, right? So they're really going to push the daughters to leave really over the sons. So after immigrating to the United States, I'm going to talk a little bit about some statistics. So the Irish were the only 19th or 20th century immigrant group in which women outnumbered the men. Between 1851 and 1901, over 3 million people, most of them Catholic, immigrated from Ireland to Canada, the United States, and Australia. By the end of the 19th century, 90% of all Irish female immigrants between the ages of 15 and 35 were single. So there were some kind of major impacts of this kind of mass migration of women. They're going to send remittances home, and this is also going to trigger chain migration. So what I mean by remittances and chain migration, the money that these women are earning, they're going to send it back either as actual money in letters. So the American letter becomes very, very important, because it's not just sharing of money or boat tickets. You're also sharing your story, saying, I'm living in the United States, I have a job. Yes, my work life might be stressful. Yes, it is hard, but it is not Ireland. And that's going to encourage sisters and female cousins to also leave. So what I'm going to show you next is actually an example from my own family, where we do have a little bit of chain migration in my own family. So the immigration of Sophie Hodges. Sophie Hodges was my great aunt, and she immigrated to New Orleans in 1904. Now, I know some of you are thinking, but Elizabeth, you said this was a 19th century program. Get it together. The reason why I'm showing Sophie Hodges as an example is because the chain migration actually began with her mother in 1890, somewhere around 1894, right? So I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so you guys can get a better look. So here's Sophie Hodges. I know it says Sophia, but her name was Sophie. In 1904, when she's arriving in Ellis Island, because she does stop in Ellis Island on the way to New Orleans. She's 19. She's single. She is. It says that her occupation is a servant. Now it says final destination, New Orleans. I'm going to go to the next kind of side of this sheet. So final destination, New Orleans. Now this is important. By whom was the passage paid? Her mother. Now, a little bit of context about my great-great-great-grandmother, Joanna Carroll. I know this says Mrs. Brandt. She remarried. My great-great-grandparents in Ireland, they never really married. We don't believe they did, at least, because Joanna Carroll, she was Catholic, and my great-great-grandfather, Robert Hodges, he was Protestant. We have no evidence to suggest that they ever got married. At one point, Robert Hodges, I guess, is tired of the whole thing and leaves, moves to England, marries another woman, has a whole other family, leaving Joanna Carroll alone with 2 children, Sophie Hodges and my great-grandfather, Samuel Hodges. So what she decides to do is she places her children into an orphanage in Dublin. I'm still waiting to hear back, actually, from the Sisters of Mercy for the records, so we know exactly which one. But she places them into an orphanage or an industrial school, one or the other. And then she leaves, and she goes to New Orleans sometime between 1892 and 1893. Sophie, when her mother left, would have only been 7 years old. So imagine being a 19-year-old traveling all the way to New Orleans from Ireland to meet up with a parent you haven't seen since you were 7 years old. Now, after Joanna immigrated, she worked different jobs in New Orleans, but interestingly enough, Sophie, the daughter, is traveling with using a ticket that her mother paid for only 2 years after her mother got married to this man named Louis Brandt. So it is quite possible that Joanna Carroll couldn't afford to have her daughter follow her until she had the money, until she had a husband who actually could help her financially. So this is kind of just one example of chain migration that I thought it would be kind of important to bring up. So the next thing we're going to talk a little bit about is work and wages. So what do these women do for work after they arrived in the United States? So the top 4, well, the top 3 to 4, some of these are things that women could be doing actually after they got married. So taking in laundry is something that a lot of married women would do. Lace making is another one, if that was a skill that they already had. Working in factories was another option. And also taking in boarders, especially if you lived in major cities like New York or Boston. But the big one that everybody knows about, or at least has an idea about, is domestic service. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to focus a lot on domestic service, namely because that is the one kind of industry that was the majority of Irish women worked in. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. So domestic service, there are some pros and cons to domestic service, but a couple of kind of I'm going to give you a couple numbers. By the end of the 19th century, 346 women of Irish stock. So this is going to be immigrants and their children worked as domestics across the country. They would make up at the end of the 19th century just under 50% of total domestic service in the entire country. So this one ethnic group is really kind of taking over this industry. In New York alone, around 1855, they made up 80% of the city's domestic servants. Now, as far as the pros and cons, first being the exposure to the American upper middle class, which this picture is actually a picture of the Merchant's House Museum. It's basically an upper middle class house museum that is in the East Village in Manhattan. And a lot of Irish women who would be working in New York, this was the type of home that they would be working in. So while, okay, yes, they're being exposed to the wealthy, that can be, negative. That could also be positive. It would be positive in the sense that they're seeing what American culture looks like. So when these women are eventually not working as domestic servants and raising families, they would be instilling some of the social practices that upper middle class women would be practicing. Some of that is to try to encourage their children to kind of assimilate into American culture, because they are going to face a lot of discrimination. I put in the cons, discrimination, which is kind of a big obvious one, because like I said, these are women who are overwhelmingly Catholic, coming to an area that is very Protestant. They're going to be working primarily for Protestant women, and there was a lot of distrust between these two groups, between the servant and the mistress. I read a quote the other day from this woman who, she was sitting in church, and she had this sudden realization, this sudden fear that her baby, who she was holding in her arms, might have been secretly baptized as a Catholic, and that she was horrified at the idea. This is all stuff that is bleeding into popular culture too. There's a reason why the term the Irish Bridget exists. It's a stereotype, and it was often meant to be kind of derogatory. So not everybody's going to be getting along. Now, as far as pros, the obvious one will be financial, which this picture is a fun one. This, for those of you who might have seen the Immigrant Savings Bank talk that I did a couple weeks ago, this image might be familiar, because the caption reads, "Irish depositors of the Immigrant Savings Bank withdrawing money to send to their suffering relatives in the old country." So this was from Frank Leslie's Illustrated. Notice the majority of the people in this image are women. If you were to even look at the bank ledgers of the Immigrant Savings Bank, you're going to see a lot of names of women. So they are able to send money home, but they're able to have their own money. They're able to actually gain a little bit of independence. So the money that they have, while it's not very much, because they aren't paying rent, which in New York or places like New York or Boston, that's a big deal. I lived in New York. You don't want to pay rent. But they're not paying rent. They're not typically having to buy food. So they have very minimal expenses. And yeah, their income wasn't particularly high, but the money they had was theirs to choose what they did with it. As far as cons go, while it is not the same type of physically strenuous as being a domestic in Ireland, where you're doing farm work, it is still exhausting. You're working very long hours for people who might not be entirely nice to you. Some employers were fine, some weren't. And you really only had one day off a week. In fact, I read the other day some quotes from mistresses actually complaining that they had to give their Catholic servants off every Sunday and all the Catholic feast days. There's constant complaining about it because they would prefer that these servants only went to church uh, for like Christmas and Easter, um, namely because they didn't want them going to a Catholic mass. They prefer them to go to a Protestant service. That's a whole other thing. So this is kind of what's going on as far as employment goes. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about marriage. So I'm not saying that Irish women were coming to the United States to find husbands. Some of them were, some of them not necessarily. And I am going to say that the people I'm talking about, I know I'm talking about statistics and stuff. This is not going to be every person's story. And I'm sure many of you have family members that immigrated in family units. I'm just kind of talking about, I'm looking at the numbers and talking about kind of the big picture. So I'm in no way saying that what I'm saying is true for all of you, for all of your family stories. But as far as marriage goes, things did improve a little bit as far as the marriage rate goes. They were marrying more, but they were not marrying as often as other immigrant groups. So, and that is going to be because, well, without the constraints of this kind of single inheritance system, the rate of marriage amongst the Irish in the United States, it's going to surpass that in Ireland. But I mean, when you compare that to the Germans or the Italians, it's just not comparable. They're still marrying more often. And similar thing with the marriage age, they are marrying younger. So instead of Irish women marrying on average at age 29, they're going to be marrying instead in their early 20s. But that age is still statistically higher than other immigrant groups. So there's still a reluctance for marriage, right? It was not uncommon for an Irish American family to include a handful of aunts, uncles, or brothers or sisters that were unmarried. But there was less of a stigma to not getting married in the United States. It didn't mean that you were no longer an adult. You still were a wage earning person. You were still a part of a family. I know in my husband's family, I can think of, because I've been working on his tree lately, at least 3 of his father's aunts didn't get married. And it was a relatively common thing. You might have one, extended relative who might even become a nun or become a priest. So people, you're still going to have fewer people getting married. But here's an interesting thing also. They're marrying other Irish people when they come to the United States. It's kind of a given. But they're also trying to marry Irish people from the same geographical area of Ireland. And a lot of people seem to forget, not everyone in Ireland gets along. Somebody from Galway is not necessarily going to like somebody from Dublin. And that's going to kind of play into who's marrying who. But there was an almost universal distaste for marriage across ethnic groups on both religious and cultural grounds. Even if you, an Irish Catholic person, was marrying another Catholic person, but that Catholic person was Italian, there's going to be a lot of drama involved. In fact, I read a quote recently. I keep saying that I read a quote recently. It's because I've been doing a lot of research for this. I read a quote where this woman had said that she hoped that her daughters never got married if it meant that they wouldn't marry an Italian person or marry somebody from a different nationality than them. As kind of a personal story, my father-in-law, his aunt was Irish American and Catholic, and she married an Italian man. Now, there were a couple things she did wrong here. She not only married an Italian, and she was Irish, she got married out of order. She had at least one or two older sisters that didn't get married before she did. This was something that, and this would have been kind of around the 20s or so. Um, and that the idea of not marrying before your older sisters, that's not strictly an Irish thing. I've heard that of other, immigrant groups as well, where if you marry before your older sister, it would tell society that there's something wrong with that older sister. Like, why is the younger sister getting married first? She must be like nuts or something. And that can almost force your siblings into spinsterhood. So this girl, her father was so upset by the entire thing that when the wedding was going on, he refused to be inside the church. He's like, I won't witness this, and just stood outside smoking cigarettes until it was over. So these kind of ideas about marriage and who you should marry, it's certainly not limited to the 19th century. It's going to continue on into the 20th and honestly the 21st too. This is still very, very prevalent. Now, the next kind of topic we're going to go into is going to be support systems. So how do these women find community aside from, marriage and family and stuff like that? So first on this list is family, right? So you might have a sister or some other extended relatives who might already be in the United States, kind of playing into that chain migration thing. So when you first arrive, you could be entirely alone here, or you could have some extended family members. But more importantly, especially for women living in, urban cities, social networks, your neighbors, your friends. If you are married and you have a sick kid, people couldn't afford necessarily to go to a doctor. The common practice would be to ask your mother. Well, if your mother's not there, who are you going to ask? You're going to ask your neighbor. Hey, what's this rash on my kid's face? So these social networks are going to be really, really important. There were also Irish American benevolent aid societies. Now, there were a lot of different types of charities in the 19th century, but a lot of them are the types of charities that Irish people would not want to access because they were, the majority of them were Protestant. But there were some that the Irish could access that they might feel a little more comfortable to access. The ones I'm going to list now are just a handful, right? This is in no way a comprehensive list. So the first one is the Women's Protective Immigration Society, Society of New York. In the late 1850s, they actually would send women west to get them out of New York City. And this was kind of a way to protect them from the dangers of living in an urban environment. And the next one is the Hibernian Society of New Orleans. Now, what they used to do in the 1850s, they actually requested that city officials station 2 Irish police officers at the dock to prevent newly Irish women from being lured into professions like prostitution. So they actually would have police officers at the dock trying to protect, these women who were coming in alone. The Hibernian Society of Baltimore, they actually at one point raised money to send women who weren't coping with their new life in the United States back to Ireland. The return rate for Irish immigrants as a whole was very, very low. It's like among the lowest of European immigrant groups. But on the rare occasion, you would have people who just couldn't make it and just wanted to go home. And the Hibernian Society of Baltimore did try to help them do that. There's also the Knights of Columbus. Now, this is a Catholic social club for men, but they also sort of attempted to provide some sort of financial security to Irish widows. There's also the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. Some of you might be familiar with the Ladies' AOH. They were organized in 1894 in Nebraska, but their primary purpose was to protect young immigrant Irish girls coming into the United States and to help them secure employment and just kind of provide a sense of, community in a place that they're not really familiar. Now, this last one, in the next, portion of this talk, I'm going to really focus on this one. And this is the mission of Our Lady of the Rosary for the protection of Irish immigrant girls. Now, this group was started by a woman named Charlotte Smith O'Brien, who was actually a Protestant woman. And in the 1870s, she really pushed for the Archdiocese of New York to create a center to help the incoming Irish immigrant women, to provide them with shelter, which would often be temporary until they would either meet up with family, or they would find employment as like a live-in domestic servant. So provide them with counseling, provide them with shelter, and also run an employment office. So she started this kind of campaign in the 1870s to get this started. The funny thing is that because she was Protestant, the Archdiocese didn't trust her. And the Irish American press actually would question whether or not she was a British spy. What is this Protestant woman's intentions? Why is she trying to help all these Catholic people? Why does she want to get involved? So the Irish American press actually accused her of being a spy in the newspapers. But it did get started. So it was established in 1884, and they helped over 100,000 girls just in their first 10 years. Now, the reason why I really want to focus on this group is because knowing a little bit about things like support systems and benevolent aid societies actually can help you with your genealogy research. This group in particular, a number of years ago, because the mission actually still exists, just in a kind of a different capacity, they actually found the records for 60,000 girls who came through this group. And they're all online for free. So I'm going to kind of give you guys a little bit of an introduction to these records and what you can do with them. So when you go to their website, which I have all of the links to this stuff in the handout, you can either search the collection by name, or you can click the browse the collection. You can browse by different type, which the next slide will actually show you what that looks like. You can browse by county, by date, by last name. It's my new favorite toy. So for the sake of an example, I chose the browse by collection. So you have 3 different options: the Ellis Island records, the mission files, and the Old Castle Garden files. So I chose the Ellis Island records. So when you click on this, you're going to see all these different options. So 1897 to 1901, etc. I chose the oldest one, so 1897 to 1901. And on this next picture on the right, it has a list of the names of ships. So it's organized. You can click by ship and by date. So I just picked a random one. I picked the Buenos Aires. And this is what the register page looks like. So these are all women who would be arriving in April of 1897. So I'm going to zoom in so you can all get a better look. So the top is the date. So it's going to start with April 25th, 1897. You have the name of the immigrant, the town and county where they're coming from, their age, the name of the ship they arrived on, and who referred them to the mission, and the address of the person who referred this girl to the mission. Now, I know some of you are probably wondering, what can I do with this information? I can tell you what you can do with this information. And I'm going to show you using an example of one girl I picked from the page we were just looking at. So her name is Mary Ann Sheridan. So here's Mary Ann Sheridan, Mary A. right? So Marianne, she was from County Cabin when she arrived in 1897, and she was 16 years old. It says that the person who referred her was somebody named Thomas Sheridan, so that could be a family member. Not everybody in that column of, who sent them are going to be family members. Some of them don't share last names. Some of them are priests. I know the mission at one point had a priest stationed at Ellis Island to greet people, to actually try to encourage them to come to the center. So Thomas Sheridan, so maybe a relation, and this is his address. Now, the reason why I want to call attention to his address is because I want you guys to notice this person lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Remember that. Okay, so what can we do with this information? Finding women, especially Irish women traveling alone on ship manifests can be a trial by fire. A lot of these women have very similar names. I mean, how many Mary Ann Sheridans do you think are coming from Ireland? It's going to be a lot, right? But this record actually gives us the date she is arriving and the ship that she was arriving on. So what I did was I went to Ancestry and I used the New York US arriving passenger and crew list. So this is going to include Castle Garden and Ellis Island. The reason why I use this particular collection on Ancestry is because you can include the ship name in your search. So I did the search, put in Mary A. Sheridan, put in her approximate birth year, and I put the month and year of arrival. I didn't put the day because when I searched, I wasn't entirely sure if April 29th was actually the day that she came through Ellis Island or the day that they just wrote her name down in the record. But turns out she did arrive in April 29th, 1897. So here's Mary Ann Sheridan. Now, how do we know that this is the right Mary A. Sheridan? Here's all of her information. When in doubt, check the original. So when I looked at the original, you see Mary Ann Sheridan. I grouped her in with the woman above her, Marguerite Sheridan. I do want to mention that these two women are not related to each other. And the reason why I say that is because the woman above her, Marguerite, is coming from Glasgow, and they're actually going to do two different places. Their final destination is two different places. So we have Mary Ann, she's 17. She's working as a domestic. Now, at the top, you see final destination, state or territory, Providence, right? So we know from that other record I just showed you from the mission that the person who referred her, Thomas, he lives in Providence. She's going to Providence. This is probably the right record. So you can use different things like this to kind of blend together, find unique ways of finding the records you're looking for, but also gives you a little bit of context. We know now that Mary Ann, when she arrived, she didn't have anyone waiting for her, and she needed help. She needed a place to stay temporarily until she made her way to Rhode Island. So I'm just going to conclude by talking about a little bit about why. Why should we care? How does this help us? So incorporating social history into your genealogy research is going to help us understand the stories of our ancestors' lives. If we can understand just a little bit about the world our family was living in, when we see their names on records, we can begin to understand how they made their life decisions, such as immigration, occupation, or who they chose to marry. When blending in traditional research within this societal and historical context, family history research will grow into something more than just names and dates on a page. It starts to become this kind of living, breathing story. So that's kind of what I have. Thanks to all of you for tuning in.